Hello, and welcome to Soroptimist International Voices, where we give a global voice to women and girls. SI Voices is a space where women's stories and issues are heard as we celebrate 100 years of our remarkable organization. We will reveal and rediscover the history of our global movement while educating and informing on many of the key challenges affecting women and girls today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast today. My name is Hilary Ratcliffe, and I'm a Soroptimist. I've been a Soroptimist for many years, but the thing that drew me to Soroptimism was that it is Soroptimist International. And for me, it's the international dimension that has made me stay with Soroptimist, enjoy it, and really feel that I'm trying to do things that are relevant and important through this Soroptimist International connection. Now, I'm going to have as my guest today someone who's very important. She's the Director of Advocacy at Soroptimist International. But I know Bev, this is Bev Bucur, her absolute passion is the international element of Soroptimism. So I'd like to ask you, Bev, can you explain how you first became involved and introduced to the idea of Soroptimism? I think it's something to do with a canoe. Do tell me about it.
Well, Hilary, it's actually a very funny and interesting story, but I was a world traveler and I did a lot of adventure traveling. And I took a trip to Irian Jaya, which today is called West Papua, New Guinea. And it was a very difficult trip. And on that trip, I met a woman whose name was Terry Phillips. And she asked all the women a series of questions like, what is your occupation? Are you married? Do you belong to any service clubs? And I remember saying to the group, these are certainly very strange questions. I feel like I'm being interviewed. Well, little did I know, but I was being interviewed. Terry was a passionate Soroptimist, and she could sell Soroptimists to anyone. So the day when we were going to travel down the river in a canoe, we were told that we would be on the river for 8 hours. We would not be getting off because the banks were quicksand, so we needed to be prepared. Well, Terry talked to me about Soroptimists for 8 hours, and by the time I got to the end of the journey, I said, "Please, please tell me, how can I join this wonderful organization?" And her response was, "Well, we're by invitation only, so, you'll have to wait for the invitation." I was really let down, but, a year later, I was formally invited to Soroptimist after going to many meetings. And then my first year as a Soroptimist, I attended the Soroptimist International, the Americas convention in Cincinnati. And at that convention, I met two remarkable Soroptimists who we have heard from and about in another podcast. One of them was Dr. Janine Jacquemin, and then the other one was the incoming president of SI, Marie-Jeanne Bossier-Berberet. And I'm sorry, I probably killed her name in French. But anyway, Marie-Jeanne explained Project Siam to all the Soroptimists in the Chicago area. And for me, that was the hook. It was such a wonderful project, and it had to do with trafficking. And I'm amazed now that we were working on projects regarding trafficking before we even called it trafficking. Hilary, you probably know a little bit more about this.
Yes, certainly. I was very interested and involved in this project in Thailand. It was called Siam because that's the old name for Thailand, and that stood for Soroptimist International AIDS Mediation. And what was happening in Thailand at the time were there many villages with very, very poor people in them. And many of the parents, desperate for money for the family, would offer their girls to go into Bangkok to work in Bangkok. They didn't realise that these girls were then going to be trafficked into the sex trade So they let the girls leave the villages, go into Bangkok, where they were traded into the sex trade. And this project was to try and provide funding in the villages, training and work in the villages, so that the girls could stay in the village, the family could earn money, and the girls didn't end up in the sex trade in Bangkok. And I've never forgotten my first introduction to that was at a conference where a woman I now know very well, she's from Yorkshire. She was a headmistress at the time of a primary school, quite a small, very dynamic Yorkshire woman. And she stood up on this stage and challenged us. And we were at that time, I think most of us in the audience had never heard of trafficking, and we never, it wasn't part of our understanding at all. And we were challenged about this project. And I remember her talking about this hotel that they had persuaded in central Bangkok to actually support this project. And they'd actually put a carpet down in the main foyer of the hotel, and the decoration in the carpet were condoms. And then I went on a visit to Thailand, and I went up to Chiang Rai, which is in the north of the country. And we went to a cafe run by the project where they actually, they used the people, the girls, to work in the cafe to earn money, and they sold products that the girls in the villages had made through this project. And the cafe had the most wonderful name of Cabbages and Condoms. And when you walked into the main foyer of the cafe, there was a huge figure, a lovely model. But when you looked closely at it, the whole model was made of condoms, to get the point over that safe sex, not sex trafficking, was what we should be working towards. So to me, that was an amazing project. And for me, that really fired my international understanding and wanting to work internationally as well. But I think, Bev, you and I both met each other when we were traveling to Sierra Leone. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that project, which was called Project Sierra, and our journey to Sierra Leone together?
Well, Hilary, Project Sierra was probably one of the highlights of my life as a Soroptimist. Um, I was always interested from that first meeting in international work, and in my local club, which was Soroptimist International of Chicago, we did a lot of work with within our own federation, working with Cochabamba. But when I saw Project Sierra and the opportunity to apply and travel on that study tour, I was so excited. I put in my application, and I was told I was well, I was not accepted at first, but I was the first one on the list in case anybody dropped out. And to my great luck, someone did drop out. So I traveled to London, and I didn't know President Sharon very well, but she did attend my conference when I was governor. And when I saw her name on the list, I asked her if she would join me in London for a few days before we would take off for Sierra Leone. And as far as our meeting, I'll just never forget, the disappointment of getting to the airport and the day that it snowed in London, and waiting, and all of the flights being canceled. But that one to Sierra Leone remained on the board. So we were all really excited that we were going. And then at the very last minute, it was canceled. So Hilary came to the rescue, and you called your Soroptimist husband, and he immediately got dinner ready, and you invited the whole group of us to come to your house, where Sharon and I slept in your bed. So when we got to Sierra Leone, we really only had 4 days, but it was just a wonderful experience, and the 4 days really seemed like much more, because so much was crammed in by Ellison Sutherland, and our guide Lois, and our guide from Hope and Homes for Children. So it was a marvelous opportunity. Um, Hillary, You want to give a little bit more information about that?
Yes, we certainly did. As you say, we got stuck in London with the snow, and we had to spend 2 days, instead of being in Freetown and Sierra Leone in lovely hot weather, we were actually in freezing cold St Albans with the snow. And I remember having to find jumpers for the group, and there were 8 of us in the group, because nobody had any warm clothes with them. But we did, as Bev said, we did eventually get to Sierra Leone, and then we packed everything into a very short time. So we felt as though we were driving all over the country visiting projects. But I think the thing that stays, 2 things particularly stay in my mind. One is when we arrived at the first project, where the girls who had been in Sierra Leone, they had actually been involved in the Civil War, and many of them had actually been raped as an act of war. They got pregnant, and they were probably 15 years old when this happened to them. They had a baby that they were trying to bring up, but no form of income. And so the project was involved in setting up nurseries for the babies, but also then training for the girls so that they could earn money to actually care for their own baby. And it was run rather like a sort of school, and they were all in a uniform, and they were all trained, and they were living together and cared for together. And I remember we drove into the area where they were living at the time, and all the girls were dressed in yellow t-shirts and green skirts, and they sang as we drove in. And I think none of us will ever forget it. They all just sang, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, Soroptimists." And the whole time we were in Sierra Leone, we were made very aware of what we were trying to do, which was, small steps forward to help this project. But all that we could do was making that amazing difference. And one of the key things was trying to get the girls accepted back into their village, because they'd been thrown out of the village because they'd brought disgrace to the village by getting pregnant when they weren't married. Not their fault, it was an act of war. But to try and recreate the village community, allow the girls back in. And I'll never forget one girl showing us she'd learned how to be a mechanic, and she'd gone into the army, and she was showing us how to strip down an engine, so that she could earn money, and she was using that to care for her child. And I think that was just, for me, certainly it was a mind-changing time in my life, actually seeing how we could effect change in a particular way. And I think that's what I remember, probably what you remember, Bev. I think you have the story of the paramount chief, don't you?
Yes. One of the things that I remember that made a big impression for me is when we had our meeting with the paramount chief. And what he said to us is that they understand the importance of including women in the decision-making process, and that he has women as part of his council, and women will remain an important part of that council. He also said, which really impressed me, that when your work is done and your project is finished, we will continue this work because we understand the importance of women in decision making, and we understand the importance of working together to make a better life for everyone. So that was really important.
Yes, I think that's what both of us are passionate about, isn't it? Trying to change things, and because we are what I would call a grassroots organisation, we try and work through the grassroots. In other words, our communities on the ground, to put in place projects to change attitudes, and then we take those projects up to the higher level, and that goes to the international level, which is obviously representing through the United Nations. And we do have representation at the United Nations. This is what we call general status at the Economic and Social Council in the United Nations. And this allows us to speak at United Nations meetings to try and influence member states. We don't make decisions, but we can actually try and influence member states. And we do that from the knowledge that we have of grassroots projects like Project Siam, or like Project Sierra, or the other projects that both Bev and I have been involved with or known about. So Bev, can you just explain a little bit about perhaps the United Nations structures that we have, very briefly, because we are represented at 7 centres, I believe, now.
Yes, Hillary, you're right. We are in 7 centers now, and we work with many groups, the Women's Major Group, the NGO Major Group, the Group on Aging, and many others. And Soroptimist is known for their grassroots work in local communities. What we do is we work two ways. We work top down, where the UN reps feed us information about the major themes and focus for the UN, including the Sustainable Development Goals and Beijing Platform for Action. And then we take the information from projects and we work bottom up. In our main reports, we include all this project information from the work that clubs do at the local level, and we report that back to the UN. Soroptimist has a great reputation as a grassroots organization. And when I have traveled to the UN centers, the when I do presentations or when we talk about our work at the UN, everyone is impressed that we are in so many countries and so many communities, and the amount of work that we do in our local work in local communities. So basically, that's the importance of our grassroots work. It really shows the UN how we as an organization make a difference on the ground for women and girls.
And I think that's so important, isn't it? That we're recognised, because I find often if I'm out just meeting people and you say I'm a Soroptimist, and sometimes you get a blank look and people really don't know what you are. But if you're walking around the UN centres, as I did, like you, as a Soroptimist, we are recognised, we are known. You do not have to explain what Soroptimist International is, because we are actually recognised. And these 7 centres that we work in are really, really important. But in my time, I've noticed how that's grown, because I first went to the UN, I suppose it's about 14 years ago. And at that time, the big commission in New York, which is known as the Commission on the Status of Women, was really in its infancy. We had very small delegations that we sent, and it was very new. And I remember the first time I went, as a women's organisation, we had to queue, because if we were going to any meetings in the UN building, we had to have a UN pass, and you had to queue to get the pass. And the first year I did it, this was in February, end of February, and New York, as many of you will know, is extremely cold. Even then, it was actually snowing and it was bitterly cold. But we had to queue outside the UN building, and the queue lasted for 4 hours. And a lot of that time I was actually outside. It wasn't too bad for me, because coming from England, I was aware of putting on warm clothes, although Bev, you live in Chicago, and I think you have much colder than I do, but I was okay. But there were a lot of people in that queue who'd come from African countries in their beautiful African clothes, but they were absolutely freezing, and there we were standing outside the UN building queuing. But like all good Soroptimists, in a queue you talk. And I remember meeting the most amazing woman in that queue, and I've never forgotten her. Her name was Lily Tapper. She came from Nepal. She was very small, about 5 foot, a very beautiful Nepalese woman. She had been married. Unfortunately, her husband had died. And in Nepal at that time, if your husband died, all your rights went. Your children were taken into the family, but they had to go and live with either the mother-in-law or an uncle. Your property was taken. Everything that you had, all your rights were taken away because you were widowed. And she was there at the United Nations to advocate that widows' rights were important. And I am delighted to say that in Nepal now, those laws have been changed, largely due to this very small lady, quietly spoken. But what an amazing experience for me, standing in this freezing cold, waiting to get my badge to go around my neck to go into the UN building, but to meet this incredible woman who I've never forgotten in the time. But the situation at the UN has changed a great deal. We now have an executive director. We have what we call UN Women, don't we? So I think you've probably seen changes, Bev, haven't you, in the way that we work at the UN centres in the last few years?
I have, Hilary, and one thing the UN reps will tell you is that it's no longer, the UN no longer wants us to stand as individual organizations, but they do want us to work together in larger groups. So that's why we are involved with groups such as the UN Caucus, NGO-CSW, all of the major groups, because that way all women get to have a voice at the table. But the other thing that's really upsetting is that because of COVID-19, so many of our rights are being rolled back. Um, it's, as you know, CSW was canceled last year. This year, for 2021, for next year, it's going to be mostly a virtual event. And what this does is it stops our ability to network with member states, with the UN, with workers in the UN, and it somewhat stops our ability to contribute to the outcome document and some of the statements. So our UN reps have been incredibly active in speaking up regarding this. Um, Betty Levy has been instrumental in getting us involved in UN 2020 and the celebration of the UN's 75th anniversary. And we've also been involved in several sessions to discuss the importance of civil society and that we still need a place at the table and we need to be involved. So we're still working to see that our hard-won gains are not rolled back and that our contributions are important to the UN and to the member states.
Yes, and I think, as you say, it's even more important because we all know that COVID-19 has impacted, I think, hardest on women and girls in all kinds of ways. And it is so important that the human rights of women and girls are protected in the post-COVID society. So it is, sometimes it can be difficult to think to the future. We've had a very difficult, or we are having a very difficult year. It seems to be that so many things that we care about are being rolled back. But it does remind me of a story that I never forget, and it always encourages me whenever I get down thinking, well, where are we going? Because the world sometimes seems an impossible place. But I think through something like Soroptimist International, we are able to make a difference. And it's the story, it's probably a story you know very well, but it's the starfish story that I always remember. I remember a very good friend in Soroptimist International giving me a starfish with a Soroptimist emblem on it to hang around my neck, which I love. And it was the fact that there was a great big storm and all these starfish were swept up onto the beach and the sea receded, and of course they were dying. And there was a little girl on the beach, and she was so upset about these starfish that she started to pick a starfish up and throw it back into the sea out of these thousands of starfish. And an old man said to her, "Why are you doing that? What's the point of doing that?" And as she picked up one starfish and flung it back into the sea, she said, "Well, it's a point for this starfish because it's going to survive." And I think it's the idea that, yes, you can feel as though you're up against the odds. Yes, you can feel that it's going to be very difficult to make a difference. But every little step we take makes a difference. And it's so important. And that's why I think, and I'm sure you do, Bev, that Soroptimist International, with its hard work, its networking, its centres, representations at the 7 UN centres, working from our grassroots and our projects, talking to member states, we can and we shall make a difference. And that's, I think, the call to anyone listening to this podcast. You mustn't be depressed. You mustn't give up in this post-COVID world. Things can change, things can improve, but it's up to every single person listening to this podcast to say, well, what tiny little step can I take? What can I do to make things a bit better? And that's my challenge to everybody as you listen to this podcast. We can and we will change and improve the world in the post-COVID-19 world. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Bev, for being with me today. And thank you, everybody, for joining in this podcast. Our next podcast is in 2 weeks' time. So do tune in and listen to another podcast. Goodbye.
You've been listening to SI Voices, a podcast hosted by Soroptimist International. Follow us on social media for our latest news and updates at Soroptimist Global on Facebook and Instagram, and at Soroptitweet on Twitter. You can also check out our website, soroptimistinternational.org. Please join us next time on SI Voices.